April 21st, 1943, Liverpool Harbour. The morning mist hung thick over the Mersey, coating everything in cold dampness that seeped through wool and canvas alike. 43 merchant ships lay anchored in the roads, their empty holds riding high in the water, waiting for the tide and the signal to form up. These were not proud vessels, most dated from the previous war, their hulls patched and repainted so many times that no man could say what colour they had been born. Their engines wheezed like old men climbing stairs. Their maximum speed, in calm seas with following wind, might reach 7 knots. In the spring storms of the North Atlantic, they would be lucky to manage 5. Commander Peter Gretton stood on the bridge of HMS Duncan, watching through binoculars as the convoy began its awkward assembly. At 30 years old, recently promoted, he commanded Escort Group B7, 2 destroyers, 1 frigate, 4 corvettes, 2 rescue trawlers. 9 warships to guard 43 merchants across 3,000 miles of ocean that Admiral Karl Dönitz had turned into a graveyard. The mathematics were simple and brutal. More than 40 German U-boats were gathering south of Greenland, positioned like wolves watching a flock of elderly sheep stumble toward them. Dönitz called it a wolf pack. The merchant sailors had other names for it, none of them spoken aloud. What neither side knew, as the convoy cleared the Irish coast and turned west into grey seas under greyer skies, was that the next 2 weeks would decide the outcome of the entire Battle of the Atlantic, not through grand strategy or technological miracle, but through something more fundamental. The moment when one side's will to hunt collided with another side's refusal to die. The transformation would be measured in bodies and wreckage, in oil slicks spreading across cold water, in the screams of men drowning in darkness. But it would also be measured in something else. The sound of depth charges, the ping of sonar, the mechanical certainty of radar sweeping invisible beams across the surface of the ocean, seeing what human eyes could not. The tools that would turn hunters into prey. In Paris, in the converted hotel that served as U-boat headquarters, Admiral Karl Dönitz studied the plot table with the satisfaction of a chess master positioning pieces for checkmate. His intelligence service, the B-Dienst, had cracked British naval codes with disturbing regularity throughout 1942 and early 1943. They knew where convoys sailed, when they departed, what routes they would follow through the mid-Atlantic gap where no land-based aircraft could reach them. For ONS 5, Dönitz was assembling something unprecedented. 3 wolf packs, Gruppe Star, Gruppe Specht, Gruppe Fink. Over 40 submarines strung across the convoy's projected route like a net waiting to close. The tactical doctrine was elegant in its brutality. Shadow during daylight, remaining beyond the horizon, invisible. Transmit position reports every few hours, vectoring other boats toward the contact. Then, after darkness fell, close on the surface at high speed, using the night as camouflage. Penetrate the escort screen, get inside the convoy columns where the merchant ships sailed, in tight formation, 4 or 5 vessels per column, 9 columns across. Fire torpedoes at point-blank range. Watch the targets explode. Dive and creep away while chaos reigned above. Surface hours later, miles away, ready to attack again. It had worked for 3 years. In 1940, the happy time when U-boats sank ships faster than Britain could replace them. In 1942, the second happy time, when American convoys off the eastern seaboard burned like torches against the lights of cities that refused to implement blackouts. By spring 1943, German submarines had sent 14 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom. 14 million tons. Enough steel to build a road across the Atlantic. Enough cargo to feed Britain for 2 years. Enough lives lost to fill a city. Dönitz calculated that if he could maintain this rate of destruction, Britain would be starved into surrender, before American industrial power could turn the tide. The mathematics supported him. U-boat construction had reached its peak. Training programs were producing new commanders monthly. The Allies were losing ships faster than they could build them. Victory was a matter of arithmetic and time. What Dönitz could not calculate, what no amount of intelligence could reveal, was that the technological balance had shifted beneath him like a ship's deck in a storm. The Allies had not announced their innovations. They had simply deployed them quietly to escort groups like B7, centimetric radar that could see surfaced submarines 5 miles away in total darkness, high-frequency direction finding that could pinpoint a U-boat's position the moment it transmitted a radio message, improved depth charges, hedgehog forward-throwing mortars. Most critically, the breaking of the German naval Enigma cipher at Bletchley Park, allowing the Allies to read Donitz's orders almost as fast as his submarine commanders. The hunters were Yai, about to discover they had been hunting something that had learned to hunt back. April 29th, the convoy crawled westward through seas that grew rougher with each passing hour. A massive low-pressure system, moving northeast from Newfoundland, collided with Arctic air sweeping south from Greenland. The result was a storm of such violence that even North Atlantic veterans watched the barometer fall and felt their stomachs tighten. Winds exceeded 60 miles per hour. Waves built to 40 feet, walls of dark water that came at the ships like moving cliffs. The temperature dropped until ice formed on rigging and railings, adding weight to vessels that were already labouring like drowning men. For the merchant ships, empty of cargo, riding high in the water, it became a fight simply to survive. They pitched and rolled through arcs that sent green water cascading over their bows, flooding decks, tearing away everything not welded down. Several lost steering temporarily as waves overwhelmed their rudders. The convoy formation disintegrated completely. Each captain focused solely on keeping his bow into the waves, preventing a broach that would roll his ship onto her side and finish her without any torpedo needed. The escorts suffered worse. Destroyers and corvettes, designed for speed and manoeuvrability rather than seakeeping, became toys in the storm's grasp. HMS Duncan buried her bow in wave after wave, solid water sweeping her foredeck and bridge. Below decks, men were thrown from bunks, equipment tore loose. The violent motion made eating impossible, sleeping a dream, merely standing a challenge that required both hands and constant vigilance. The corvettes, with their rounded hulls, rolled through arcs exceeding 40 degrees. Crew members lashed themselves to stations and simply endured, too exhausted and seasick to do more than wait for the storm to pass. Yet the storm provided unexpected mercy. U-boats attempting to shadow the convoy found surface operations suicidal. Waves swept over their low, conning towers, making observation impossible. They could submerge, but underwater they were blind and slow, unable to track targets that moved erratically in the chaos above. For 36 hours, nature accomplished what the escorts could not, keeping the wolf pack at bay. But storms pass. By May 4th, the seas calmed, the sky cleared to cold blue. The scattered convoy began regrouping, ships emerging from the horizon like survivors crawling from wreckage. Lieutenant Commander Sherwood, commanding from HMS Tay after Gretton's forced departure to refuel on May 3rd, counted vessels and calculated odds. The U-boats had also been regrouping. Now, in calm water under clear skies, they closed for the kill, May 4th. Darkness fell at 21:30 hours. 40 minutes later, the mathematics of torpedo warfare began asserting themselves with mechanical precision. Explosions lit the night like lightning, orange fireballs climbing into the sky as cargo holds detonated. Ships lurched, listed, began settling by the stern. Lifeboats dropped into water so cold it would kill a man in 15 minutes. Rescue ships moved through the darkness, searching for survivors, pulling frozen men from the sea, knowing they could not save everyone. Through that night and into May 5th, the U-boats demonstrated why Dönitz believed victory was certain. They penetrated the escort screen with practiced ease. They positioned themselves between convoy columns, in the heart of the merchant formation, where targets surrounded them at ranges measured in hundreds of yards rather than thousands. They fired, reloaded, fired again. Torpedoes crossed the water in phosphorescent wakes, tracks of light leading to destruction. By noon on May 5th, 5 ships had been sunk during the night attacks. Then, in the space of 30 minutes around midday, 3 more ships, Selvestan, Garinda and Bonde, were struck almost simultaneously. They went down within minutes, their crews barely having time to abandon ship. The pattern seemed familiar, inevitable, the same slaughter that had characterized the Atlantic War since 1940. German submarines attacking with impunity. Allied convoys bleeding ships like wounded animals leaving a trail. The escorts racing through the darkness, firing star shells that illuminated nothing, dropping depth charges at contacts that vanished like ghosts. By evening on May 5th, the convoy had lost 12 ships. The wolf pack circled for the final kill. What the German commanders did not know, what they could not see, was that something fundamental had changed in the equations of hunter and prey. The escorts were not simply defending anymore. They were hunting, and the tools they carried, the invisible weapons of radar and sonar and direction finding, were about to demonstrate what happens when technological surprise meets tactical confidence. The night of May 5th to 6th, 1943. The ocean was calm, the visibility perfect, the moon not yet risen. Conditions favoured the submarines, or so every U-boat commander believed. They surfaced in the darkness, confident in their invisibility, preparing to press home attacks that would annihilate what remained of the convoy. Instead, they surfaced into a killing field. HMS Pink's radar detected a contact at 4:30 hours. Range, 4 miles. The corvette turned toward the target, increasing speed, her crew racing to action stations in the darkness. The U-boat's lookouts saw nothing until Pink was less than a mile away, her bow wave white in the starlight. U-192 crash-dived, but too late. Pink's commander had fought this kind of engagement before. He knew exactly where the submarine would be after diving. His depth charges were already set to the correct depth. The patterns rolled off the stern as Pink passed over the swirl of disturbed water marking the U-boat's dive. The ocean erupted. Underwater, the shock waves crushed U-192's pressure hull like a hammer striking an egg. She surfaced moments later, mortally wounded, water pouring through ruptured seams. Her crew abandoned ship, jumping into the cold Atlantic. Pink circled cautiously, lowering boats to pick up survivors. 41 German sailors were pulled from the water. U-192 sank bow first, sliding beneath the waves with a sound like a sigh. 2 hours later, HMS Oribi gained radar contact on another submarine. The destroyer turned toward the target, accelerating to 30 knots, her 4-inch gun crew standing ready. U-125 attempted to dive, but Oribi closed too fast. The destroyer's bow struck the submarine's pressure hull amidships, a grinding collision that tore steel and ruptured tanks. The U-boat surfaced, unable to submerge, her crew pouring onto the deck. HMS Snowflake arrived moments later and finished the job with depth charges. The survivors watched their boat die, then swam through oil-slicked water toward the rescue nets. HMS Vidette, equipped with the new Hedgehog forward-throwing mortar, caught U-531 on the surface at 03:15 hours. The Hedgehog fired 24 contact-fused bombs in a circular pattern ahead of the attacking ship, allowing Vidette to maintain sonar contact throughout the attack. The bomb struck water, sank, and detonated only when they hit the submarine's hull. The underwater explosions were different from depth charges, sharper, more concentrated. U-531 broke apart beneath the surface. There were no survivors. HMS Pelican found U-439 attempting to escape at 0445 hours. The sloop pursued for 30 minutes, maintaining sonar contact through every evasion attempt the German commander made. Then Pelican's depth charges spoke. The patterns were precise, calculated, deadly. Oil and debris surfaced. HMS Pelican circled the wreckage field, searching for survivors. She found none. HMS Lucistrife sank U-638 just before dawn, catching the submarine as it attempted to surface after a prolonged underwater chase. The corvette's depth charges forced the U-boat up, damaged and leaking. Lucistrife's guns finished what the depth charges began. The German crew abandoned ship. The submarine sank in water so deep her wreckage would never be found. By dawn on May 6th, 5 U-boats had been destroyed in less than 6 hours. 5, a number that meant nothing until measured against 3 years of Atlantic warfare, where sinking even one submarine in a single convoy battle was considered success. The exchange ratio had not just shifted, it had inverted. The hunters had become the hunted, and the prey had developed teeth. In Paris, Admiral Dunitz read the reports with growing horror. Not horror at the losses themselves. Submariners died, this was the nature of their service, but horror at what the losses meant. The mathematics that had promised victory were collapsing. 12 merchant ships sunk? Yes. But 6 U-boats confirmed destroyed, 7 more damaged, some severely enough to abort their patrols and limp home to ports where repairs might take months. The exchange ratio that made U-boat warfare viable, the ratio that had brought Britain to the edge of starvation, had inverted catastrophically. A U-boat required a year to build, a crew required longer to train, and even with training, experience was irreplaceable. The commanders now dying in the North Atlantic were veterans, men who had survived dozens of patrols, who had learned through brutal experience the tricks that kept submarines alive. Each loss represented not just a boat, but accumulated wisdom that could never be recovered. Germany's submarine training program could produce new boats faster than it could produce competent commanders and experienced crews. More disturbing were the reports from surviving commanders. They spoke of being detected before they could even approach the convoy, of escorts that seemed to know exactly where they were, even in total darkness, of being pursued with relentless aggression rather than passive defence, of radar that could see through the night, of sonar that tracked them through every evasion manoeuvre, of depth charges that detonated with uncanny precision at exactly the right depth. The technological superiority that Germany had enjoyed in 1940 had evaporated. The tactical dominance that the wolf packs had maintained for 3 years was gone, replaced by something more ominous: systematic, mechanised, industrialised anti-submarine warfare executed with the same ruthless efficiency that characterised American production. The Allies had not merely caught up, they had leapfrogged ahead, and done so quietly, without announcement or warning. On May 24, 1943, 18 days after the ONS 5 battle concluded, Dönitz made the most significant strategic decision of the Atlantic War. He ordered all U-boats withdrawn from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The official reason given to Hitler was temporary, a pause to re-equip submarines with improved weapons and defensive systems. The reality was starker and simpler. The U-boat offensive had been defeated. German submarines could no longer operate effectively against well-defended convoys. The war that was supposed to starve Britain into submission before America's industrial power could make itself felt had been lost. The statistics for May 1943 told the story in numbers that even Nazi propaganda could not obscure. German U-boats sank 50 Allied merchant ships. In exchange, they lost 41 submarines. 41. Nearly 1 in 3 U-boats that went to sea in May never returned. For the young men who crewed these boats, the implications were terrifying and inescapable. U-boat service had transformed from an elite force to a death sentence. Of the 40,000 Germans who would serve in U-boats during the war, 30,000 would die. A 75% casualty rate, the highest of any military service on either side of the conflict. The withdrawal from the North Atlantic had immediate and profound consequences. Allied convoys that had been crossing with 20, 30, 40% losses began arriving with minimal casualties. The supplies that had been desperately scarce in Britain, food, fuel, ammunition, raw materials, now flowed freely across shipping lanes that German submarines could no longer contest. The build-up for the invasion of Europe could proceed without the constant fear of supply lines being severed. American forces and equipment poured into British ports, transforming the island into a vast military base. But the strategic shift represented more than tactical success or technological advantage. It represented the triumph of industrial capacity over tactical brilliance, of systematic production over individual skill, of overwhelming material superiority over courage and determination. The same lesson that German POWs were learning in camps across America, watching electric lights burn wastefully through the night and factories produce more in a week than the Reich managed in a month. The P-47 Thunderbolt had demonstrated it in the skies over Europe. 8 machine guns firing 6,000 rounds per minute, enough firepower to disintegrate aircraft that German propaganda had claimed were invincible. The Liberty ship program had demonstrated it in American shipyards. Building cargo vessels faster than U-boats could sink them, replacing losses overnight, turning the arithmetic of attrition into an equation the Germans could never win. The escort carrier program demonstrated it in the North Atlantic, closing the air gap, providing continuous air cover, hunting submarines with aircraft equipped with radar and depth charges, and now ONS 5 had demonstrated it in the most fundamental way possible. A slow convoy of elderly merchant ships, defended by a handful of escorts, had faced the largest concentration of U-boats ever assembled against a single target. It had lost ships. It had watched men die in freezing water. It had endured attacks that in any previous year would have resulted in annihilation, and yet it had survived, more than survived. It had inflicted losses on the submarine fleet that proved unsustainable. It had demonstrated that the technological and tactical balance had shifted permanently. The lesson was being repeated across every theatre of the war. In the Pacific, where American submarines were strangling Japan's merchant fleet, with the same efficiency that German U-boats had once demonstrated in the Atlantic. In the skies over Germany, where bomber streams protected by long-range fighters were systematically destroying industrial capacity. In every factory, shipyard and arsenal across the United States and Britain, where production lines operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing war material at rates that seemed impossible to mines, shaped by European resource constraints, Germany had challenged the world's greatest industrial powers with courage, tactical skill, and technological innovation. For a time, those advantages had been enough, but courage cannot replace oil when the tanks run dry. Tactical brilliance cannot feed soldiers when the supply lines are cut. Technological innovation means nothing when the enemy can match it and then exceed it through sheer scale of production. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The Allies could lose 1,000 ships, build 1,500, and still have material left over. Germany could lose 100 U-boats and face a crisis that threatened the entire submarine force. Convoy ONS 5 arrived in Halifax, Nova Scotia, on May 12, 1943. 30 merchant ships, reduced from 43, their empty holds still riding high despite the ballast they carried. On the docks, families waited for men who would never arrive. Telegrams were already being delivered to addresses in Liverpool, Glasgow, New York, Oslo. The cold mathematics of war reduced to individual grief, to children who would grow up without fathers, to wives who became widows, to parents who outlived their sons. The crews who survived carried memories they would never fully articulate. The sound of torpedoes striking steel, the screams of men burning in oil fires on the surface of the ocean, the sight of ships breaking in half, their backs snapped by explosions, the cold that seeped into bones during hours in lifeboats waiting for rescue that might not come, the faces of friends who had been there in the morning and were gone by evening. In Germany, other families were receiving telegrams. 41 submarines lost in May, approximately 2,000 men dead in a single month. Entire crews disappeared without trace, their boats crushed by depth charges or sunk by aircraft, going down in waters so deep that the wrecks would never be found. The men who had been told they were the elite, the tip of the spear that would bring Britain to her knees, had died in darkness at the bottom of the Atlantic. The surviving U-boat crews returned to ports where the atmosphere had changed. The confidence that had characterized the service in 1940 and 1941 was gone, replaced by something that medical officers began calling operational exhaustion, though the veteran submariners had simpler terms for it: fear. The knowledge that every patrol might be your last, that the tactics that had worked for 3 years no longer guaranteed survival, that the Allies had learned to hunt submarines with the same systematic efficiency they brought to every other aspect of industrial warfare. German submarine veterans who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without flinching spoke of escort destroyers in hushed tones. They described the sound of depth charges, the metallic ping of sonar, the knowledge that somewhere above, an enemy with radar and direction-finding equipment was tracking them through the darkness. They talked about the aggression of Allied escorts, the way they pursued contacts for hours, refusing to give up, coordinating attacks with multiple ships. Most of all, they talked about the mathematics. The cold calculation that if losses continued at May's rate, the U-boat arm would be destroyed within 6 months. Naval historians would later identify Convoy ONS 5 as the turning point, the moment when the technological and tactical balance shifted irreversibly against the German submarine fleet. Not because of any single innovation or brilliant tactic, but because of accumulated advantages that had finally reached critical mass. Better radar, improved sonar, more escorts, escort carriers closing the air gap, breaking of German codes, training programs that produced experienced crews faster than Germany could replace losses, industrial capacity that could absorb staggering losses and still increase production. But beneath the analysis and statistics lay a simpler truth. Ordinary men on both sides had fought with everything they possessed. German submarine crews had pressed home attacks despite knowing they faced improved defences. Allied merchant sailors had sailed voyage after voyage into waters where death came on a torpedo's wake. British and Canadian escort crews had hunted submarines with relentless determination despite exhaustion that bordered on physical collapse. None of them knew they were fighting the battle that would decide the war's outcome. They knew only that their side needed them to continue, so they continued. The Battle of the Atlantic would rage for 2 more years. More ships would be sunk, more submarines would be destroyed, more men would die in cold water far from any shore, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. May 1943 marked the month when Allied victory became inevitable and German defeat merely a matter of time. The U-boat offensive that had come closer than any other German strategy to bringing Britain to her knees had been broken. Not through any single battle or technological miracle, but through the systematic application of industrial power, tactical innovation, and human determination. Commander Peter Gretton received the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership of Escort Group B7. Many of his crew members received decorations for actions during the battle, but Gretton himself would later write that the real heroes were the merchant sailors who sailed voyage after voyage despite knowing the odds, who continued because the supplies they carried were essential to victory, who accepted the risk because someone had to, and it might as well be them. The convoys continued. Through 1943, through 1944, through the final months of 1945 when Germany's war machine ground to a halt for lack of fuel and raw materials, the shipping lanes that U-boats had contested remained open, feeding the armies that would liberate Europe, sustaining the populations that refused to surrender, demonstrating that industrial power, properly applied, could overcome any tactical or technological advantage. The North Atlantic today bears no scars from the battles fought in its waters 80 years ago. The ocean has reclaimed its dead, covered the wrecks, erased the evidence of struggle. The merchant ships that were sunk rest in water so deep that no light reaches them, their holds still empty, their crews still at their stations. The U-boats that hunted them lie on the ocean floor, their pressure hulls crushed by the weight of water, their crews entombed in steel coffins that will last 1,000 years. But the consequences of those battles echo still. The failure of the U-boat offensive meant Britain survived. It meant the invasion of Europe could proceed. It meant Allied victory became possible rather than merely hoped for. Convoy ONS 5 was one battle among hundreds in the Atlantic War. 12 ships lost among thousands that would never return. 13 if you count the records differently, sources varying slightly on the final tally. But it was the battle where the tide finally turned, where the hunters became the hunted, where the apparently invincible met the simply determined and learned that courage and technology, properly combined, could overcome any advantage. The lessons of ONS 5 extended beyond naval warfare. They spoke to fundamental truths about industrial conflict in the 20th century. That production capacity mattered more than individual valour. That technological innovation required constant effort rather than resting on past achievements. That training programs needed to produce not just soldiers, but experienced crews who could use advanced equipment effectively. That intelligence, breaking enemy codes, analysing patterns, anticipating moves, could multiply the effectiveness of every other advantage. That systematic, organised industrial warfare would defeat individual brilliance given sufficient time and resources. Germany had built the most experienced submarine force in history, had developed tactics that brought 3 maritime empires to the edge of defeat, had produced boats and weapons that represented the cutting edge of naval technology, and lost because the Allies matched every innovation, exceeded every capability, and produced more of everything than German industry could replace. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. When one side can afford to lose and the other cannot, the outcome is predetermined. Only the casualties remain uncertain. The 13 merchant ships lost carried men who would never see their homes again, who died in darkness and cold water far from any shore. For their families there was no victory, only absence. The 6 U-boats destroyed took with them crews who had believed they were fighting for something worth dying for, who went to their deaths not knowing that their sacrifice would prove meaningless, that Germany's cause was already lost. For their families, there was only the telegram, the condolences, the empty chair. War's accounting reduces individuals to numbers, transforms, lives into statistics, converts grief into strategic calculations. Convoy ONS 5 paid the price that victory demanded: 13 ships for 6 submarines and 7 damaged. In the merciless mathematics of global war, that exchange rate spelled the difference between defeat and survival, between darkness and hope, between tyranny triumphant and tyranny ground, down by the accumulated weight of industrial power that would not be denied. The battle's legacy lives in the silent depths, where submarines and merchant ships rest together, former enemies united in the democracy of death. It lives in the memories of survivors who carried what they experienced into old age, who never forgot the sound of depth charges, or the sight of ships breaking apart, or the faces of men who stepped off the bridge one morning and were gone by evening. It lives in the strategic histories that mark May 1943 as Black May, the month when the Kriegsmarine lost the Battle of the Atlantic, and with it any hope of starving Britain into submission. They came as wolves hunting prey that could not fight back. They left as prey learning that what they hunted had developed teeth. The ocean remembers what we forget. That victory is written in wreckage and bodies as much as strategy and courage. That the mathematics of industrial war favour those who can produce, endure, and adapt faster than their enemies can destroy, resist, and innovate. That sometimes the turning point of history occurs not in a single dramatic moment, but across a week of darkness, depth charges, and dying ships, where the only witness is cold water and the only monument is silence.